And the next panel is Canada's Human Rights Challenges in the New Middle East. And we are very honored and privileged to have three women. I'd like them to come up now, please. And Nazanin, I'm going to introduce Nazanin Afshin-Jam, who is an international human rights and democracy activist and president and co-founder of Stop Child Education's organization, whose aim is to put an end to executions of children worldwide. She's a former board member of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, global youth educator with Red Cross, singer, songwriter, actor, and Miss World Canada. And that's enough. And we are very privileged to have her here today, and she will introduce the other women I'm so privileged to have as my friends, Marina Nemat and Raheel Raza. I would just like to say briefly before their introduction that Nazanin holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and political science from the University of British Columbia and a master's in diplomacy from Norwich in the United States. She concentrated on international conflict management there, and she's a recipient of several human rights awards of distinction. She's given speeches at numerous parliaments, universities, and conferences, as well as at the United Nations. Nazanin just completed a book, which will be published by HarperCollins in May, entitled The Tale of the Two Nazanins. So you can look forward to a business lunch lecture on that. And this is about the campaign that she led on her own to help save the life of a teenager on death row in Iran. She's currently trying to form a new organization to help Iranians on their path to freedom and democracy. And Nazanin?
Thank you very much, Meryl. I'd like to apologize in advance. I woke up this morning, lost my voice, but it seems like it's getting back, so I'm happy for that. Thank you, Advocates for Civil Liberties and the Atlantic Council of Canada, for putting on this very timely conference to address some of the urgent issues that concern the Middle East and consequently affect Canada and other parts of the world. It's an honor to be here with Marina Nemat and Raheel Raza to present on the panel entitled Canada's Human Rights Challenges in the Middle East. I will introduce our speakers and then they'll present, and at the end we'll have time for discussion. Unfortunately, Marina Nemat will have to leave earlier. No? Oh, good. Well, then you'll have all of us here. So first I will present Marina Nemat. Marina Nemat was born in Iran. After the Islamic Revolution in 1979, at the age of 16, she was arrested and kept as a political prisoner for over 2 years, tortured, and came close to execution. She moved to Canada in 1991. She's an award-winning author for her memoir, Prisoner of Tehran, which has been published in 28 other countries, and she's just released a second book called After Tehran, A Life Reclaimed. Marina spends much of her time concentrating on human rights issues. She sits on several boards, including the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture, and on advisory boards at Action by Christians for the Abolition of Torture and PEN Canada. I've seen her speak many times. I've had the big privilege, and I've read her book, and I highly recommend it, so I'd like to welcome Marina Nemat.
Thank you, Nazanin. It's always a pleasure to see you. You look more beautiful every time. So, you know, Iranian women are all beautiful, aren't they? Yes. Thank you. So here, I'm going to just jump right in. First of all, yes, I was supposed to be, let me jump in here. I was supposed to be going to Ottawa tonight to be at a meeting with, early tomorrow morning with the Minister of Consular Affairs in Ottawa about the case of Hamid Qasemi Shal, a Canadian citizen who went to Iran 4 years ago to visit his family, his ailing mother. He had gone to Iran a few times before. Nothing bad had happened. He was a shoe salesman, not a political person, had never done anything seriously political in his life, and he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm not going to get into details. You can go to the website and read it, freehamid.org, and he was arrested. And he's been in Evin prison for 4 years now. His brother died, it seems like under torture in Evin prison, and Hamid is right now on death row. So for 4 years, Antonella Mega, Hamid's wife, has been trying to get her husband home. And you can, I guess you can imagine her pain and anguish, because they just keep on putting him on death row, off death row, on death row, off death row. And it's nerve-wracking. And she's had a few nervous breakdowns. So I'm going to get back into this story closer to the end of my talk, so that we can kind of put it into context of what can Canada do to help human rights in Iran. You know, I have been basically in the front of that in a way, so I can definitely share my experiences on that with you. I was born in Iran in 1965. And when I was growing up, Iran was not an Islamic republic. We had a king, we called him the Shah, and I was from a middle-class family. My dad was a ballroom dancing instructor. Oh yeah, ballroom dancing in Iran. And my mom was a hairdresser. So I literally grew up between the sounds of the cha-cha and the tango and women with big poofy hair. And we owned a cottage by the Caspian Sea. I would get together with my friends, and the girls would be wearing their little bikinis with the boys, and take our boomboxes to the beach, and we would be dancing to the tunes of the Bee Gees. And I was madly in love with Donny Osmond and wanted to marry him. And I watched The Little House on the Prairie together with my friends, dubbed into Farsi, when I was growing up in Iran. I went to a Zoroastrian high school for girls in Tehran. I'm not a Zoroastrian. I'm from a tiny Christian minority in Iran. And back then, your religion was not an issue. You could be anything. I never, ever felt discriminated against, ever, because of my religion, even though there were 2 Christians in my school. So tiny, tiny minority. Iran right now is probably 99% Muslim. And you know, again, growing up, Iran was a very westernized, extremely westernized country. I wanted to become a medical doctor. At the time, women could become judges. They could even become the prime minister. The law didn't stop women from doing whatever they wanted to do. As you know, the same thing that a man could do, a woman could do as well. And schools were free at the time, including universities. So my road seemed to be clear. I wanted to grow up, marry Donny Osmond, become a doctor, and live happily ever after. Great plan. Didn't exactly work out that way. And then when I was 13 years old, the revolution happened, and I literally watched it from my window, because we lived in downtown Tehran. Kind of, it was like living in Tahrir Square. It was the same thing. The street would fill with angry demonstrators. They would yell slogans against America and Israel and communists and East and West, everybody. I never heard death to Canada, though. And they were very angry because the Shah had oppressed them. There was political oppression in Iran, and all of that. Of course, I was unaware because I was a teenager. And to me, I was from a middle-class family. I had a good life, and I couldn't understand what was happening, but it was happening nevertheless. So the Islamic Revolution, I'm not going to get into detail. This is not the place or time for it, but it did succeed. And Shah left the country. Khomeini came into Iran. And we had free referendums. We had a free referendum that asked the people of Iran yes or no to an Islamic Republic, and 98% of the people of Iran said yes to an Islamic Republic. But if you ask them, and trust me, I did try, what is an Islamic Republic? Nobody could give you a straight answer. Khomeini had promised the people of Iran that an Islamic Republic is going to be great. He had promised the people of Iran that he would step aside and he would allow them to choose their own president and their own government freely. But of course, that was not the case. That was not what happened. Again, I'm not going to get into the details of what. That would take, why and what, and that would take a long time. But things began to change in Iran, and horror began to unfold. Now, I want to give you a footnote here. Horror in history doesn't happen overnight. It's not that you go to bed tonight and tomorrow you have Hitler on your hands, or Mao, or Stalin. It doesn't work that way. I promise you that Mao, Stalin, Hitler, they were born as babies, just like all of us. They were not born when they were 30. And I promise you that when they were 2, they were very cute. But then they grew up and they became huge mass murderers. What happened? And by the way, Hitler, for example, did not happen in the Middle East. Hitler happened in a civilized country, Germany, and there was a democratic process in place. So as some of the other speakers have put emphasis on this very important fact that democracy is not immune to horror. Democracy is a process. It is not an event. And this process can be derailed at many different times and under many different circumstances. So please, because here in Canada, because we have democracy, please don't even for a moment assume that we are immune to losing it. Democracy is like water. You hold it in the palms of your hands, you take your eyes off it for a split second, and it could drip through your fingers. And in Iran, we saw the danger signs. Books, newspapers, magazines, publications, they became illegal. Writers and activists and thinkers and university professors, they were being fired and they were put in jail. And we did protest. I was on the streets of Tehran. I was 15 years old. I was on the streets of Tehran protesting back then, in 1980. But the world didn't see it because foreign journalists had been expelled from Iran. Of course, the world did hear about American hostages because Americans are important and everybody knows about them. But I'm sure you didn't hear about my generation on the streets of Tehran as early as 1980. We were protesting. What were we protesting? Well, the new dress code. You take fun away from teenagers. They are going to be on the street. If tomorrow Mr. Harper declares that iPods are illegal, what do you think is going to happen? Teenagers are going to be on this. Not you, but teenagers are going to be on the street. And Canada is going to become an Apple Republic. So if you take fun out of life, and that's what happened in Iran, because dancing illegal, singing illegal, wearing bright colors illegal, being happy illegal, holding your boyfriend's hand in public illegal, all of these weird rules. Not only we didn't gain our political freedoms, but we lost our personal ones. So of course the teenagers were on the streets of Tehran and they were yelling and screaming. And of course the grown-ups didn't really join us because they were too busy paying their bills and car payments and arguing with their teenagers and worrying about stuff. But we were out there. And the result of that was that the newly formed Revolutionary Guard and the militia, this is a civilian militia, the Basij, it attacked us on the streets. At the beginning, it was with clubs and a baseball bat kind of things, and they would just run after us and beat us up. But then after that, they soon graduated to actual guns and shooting at teenagers on the streets. But of course, the world didn't hear that. And then the waves of arrest began in 1981. And my first classmate who was arrested, her name was Shahnoush Behzadi, and she was 15 and she was Zoroastrian. And one day I went to school, she wasn't there. I called her house because she came to school even when she had the flu. So I called her house and I asked her mother, Mrs. Behzadi, where is Shahnoush? And the mother was crying on the phone and she said they arrested Shahnoush at home last night. And I couldn't understand it because Shahnoush was 15 and she was afraid of spiders. So I couldn't understand why would they arrest a girl who's 15 and afraid of spiders. It didn't add up. So I said to the mother, don't worry about it. How bad can it get? Well, please never ask that question because it can get really bad before you know it. Every day you would go to school and there would be a desk empty. People would be missing and we all looked at each other and we all said, hey, how bad can it get? Well, it was getting really bad. They came for me on January 15, 1982. I was about to take a bath. Late at night, 9, 10 o'clock, they always came in the middle of the night, not to attract attention. And the doorbell rang, my mom called my name, I opened the bathroom door and there were 2 guns pointed in my face. People have asked me, were you scared? No, I was not. Not because I'm brave, I'm not. I'm actually afraid of cockroaches. No, I'm not brave at all. But what happens is that you have grown up reading Jane Austen, Ernest Hemingway, watching Donny and Maria Osmond, and dancing to the tunes of the Bee Gees, and now there are 2 guns pointed in your face, and you're 16 years old. What you're going to do is you're going to enter a state of shock. A state of shock is like body armor. It is a survival mechanism. You put it on, and it protects you against emotion. Not against bullets, unfortunately, but against emotion. It's very easy to get in there, but getting out of there is really difficult. I was looking at my mom and dad, and they were crying, and I couldn't understand why they were crying. I was just getting arrested, no big deal. So they put me in a car, they drove me north to Evin prison, which was supposed to turn into a museum with the fall of the Shah. Of course, it didn't. It is right now very much operational and has thousands of prisoners, and people are still being executed there after arbitrary trials. And they took me up on hallway after hallway, and they interrogated me, and of course, what I told them apparently didn't please them. And then they took me to another room, and there they took off my blindfold, and I was in a room with two men, Ali and Hamid, and they decided to handcuff me. They handcuffed me, then they realized I was 16 and I was 95 pounds. And they saw that my hands are going to slide out of the cuffs. So they put both of my wrists together, and they put the two wrists in one cuff, and as it clicked, I literally heard my bones crack. And the torture had not even begun yet, and I screamed my head off. I was, at the time, a devout Catholic, and I had grown up reading about saints. Of course, the reason for my arrest was not because I was a Christian, was because I had protested against the government. But I had grown up reading about saints, and I could never understand really deeply how difficult it is to really be tortured. But right there and then, if the devil had appeared and had offered to, you know, give me your soul and I'll get you back home to your mother, I would have sold my soul with whipped cream on top. And I would have I just wanted to go home to my mother. That's all. I just wanted to go home, plain and simple, and I would have done anything to get out of that room, but that was not an option. They tied me up, and they took off my socks and my shoes, and they lashed the soles of my feet with a length of cable. That's a favorite method of torture in Evin. And in the 80s, in Evin prison, I met a lot of people, and not even one of them told me that they were not tortured. So everyone, almost everyone, at least back then, was tortured in Evin prison severely. So they would beat you and beat you and beat you. And the Chinese believe that your nerve ends are in your feet. So reflexology, and this is why it's so great and so wonderful. But imagine the opposite. With every strike of the lash, your nervous system explodes, and then it's magically put back together, and you're ready for the second strike. And if you think you're going to pass out, think again, because you're not. So they beat me and beat me and beat me, and eventually they untied me, and I sat up, and I looked at my feet, and they looked like overgrown party balloons with toes on them. And they were blue. And I laughed loud because it was funny. They looked funny. And then they made me walk. And then they would start all over again. They staggered the torture. Why? Because if they continue beating you constantly, the skin would break and you will die from infection. The point of torture is not to kill you. The point of torture is to break you, to break the human soul. The point of torture is not even getting information. Those who use torture and tell you that it is designed to get information, they lie. I've been there. Torture, you say anything under torture to get out of that room. I signed all the papers they gave me. Maybe one of them said I was Jesus Christ and I signed it. I don't know, maybe one of them said I was a CIA spy and I signed it. I don't know what I signed. Do you honestly think that you're going to read what they give you under those circumstances? No, you're going to tell them what they want to hear. So the point of torture is not getting information. It is destroying the human soul. So this is why they don't really want to kill you necessarily, unless you don't break. If you don't break, you die. It's a very simple mathematical equation. So then I was sent to the cell block, and there were I was given a death sentence. Then the sentence was reduced to life in prison. And back then in Evin, it was easy to get a death sentence because thousands of prisoners were entering a prison that was built for only a few hundred. There was no place to put people. So when you don't have room to put people in a political prison, what are you going to do? You're going to kill them. And where are you going to start the killing? From the weakest and the youngest. So if you were 15, you had a much greater chance of being executed. Shahnush, the girl I told you, she was executed even before I was arrested. So these were the circumstances in Evin prison in the 80s. 90% of us were teenagers. 15, 16-year-old kids in Evin prison. At least during the time of the Shah, the political prisoners were adults. Not us. And then they took me to the cell block. I was sent to the cell block, in which each one of the cells, during the time of the Shah, there were 5 or 6 prisoners. During my time, there were 50, 60, or 70. You put so many people in a small room, you're going to have problems. Well, the fact that we were always hungry, that was definitely one problem. The other problem was that there was no hygiene. The third problem was going to the bathroom, because we had 1 bathroom and 300 people. So how do you go? And in the middle of the night, if you wanted to go to the bathroom, which I always need to, we slept like sardines on the floor. So if I wanted to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, I would have to literally walk on people, because there was no room to put your foot on the floor between them. So of course you don't go to the bathroom, because these are your friends and they're bloody and swollen. So you wait for the morning, and then in the morning there are 300 people in line in front of you to go to the bathroom. So then you stand there and wait. And as you're standing in line, there are names being announced over the loudspeakers. So and so and so and so come to the office. And these people are taken to be tortured or to even be executed. Now, if your name is called, you are going to go, because if you don't go, you're definitely going to die. So you would go nicely without making a fuss, because then you have a better chance of survival. So the rest of us, we are standing there, again, 90% under the age of 20, basically girls, teenage girls. And what did we do? We did what teenage girls do best. We talked. And what did we talk about? About social justice? No, that didn't end well. No, we talked about everything that makes you human. I don't know what makes you human, but I discovered my humanity in a bathroom line in Evin prison. It's your happy memories. Collect them. We talked about birthday parties, family reunions, vacations at the Caspian, Donnie and Marie Osmond, the Bee Gees, brothers, cousins, you name it. And by doing that, we created a beacon of hope that belonged to all of us and kept us alive, because it reminded us that we were human, even though the world didn't give a damn what was going on in Iranian prisons. And there were thousands of us, but the world didn't know, or it didn't want to know. I don't know. But we were there and nobody was talking about it. And we knew that. So we talked. We tried to sustain each other. And the girl I was before Evin prison died in Evin somewhere. And the person I have become is a witness. No more, no less. I carry the memories of every girl who ever stood in a bathroom line with me. Every single one of them is my responsibility, because many of them are buried in mass graves, and many of those who survive are incapable of speaking out because they are so traumatized. And I totally understand it, because they are still in a state of shock. So I am a witness, and my life would lose meaning if I don't speak about those teenagers who died in Iran in the 80s, who suffered so much that still now, 30 years later, are still incapable of speaking about it. Devastated, basically. So anyhow, I'm going to make a long story short. I was eventually actually released from Evin prison 2 years, 2 months, 12 days after I had been arrested. And when I went home, after 2 years, 2 months, 12 days, I was just shy of my 19th birthday, and it was March 26th when I was released. And I sat at a dinner table with my parents, and they talked about the weather. Nobody wanted to talk about it. My parents were good people. It was difficult. How do you do it? If we talk about it, they talked about it, if they told the neighbors about it, they would be arrested. If we talked about it, why do you even want to dig out that dirt? Let's move ahead. Let's look forward. What's the point of talking? And the other reason why people don't talk about it, one of the reasons is fear and trauma. But the other reason is that if you talk about it, if you acknowledge it, then somebody might ask you, if you knew, why didn't you do something about it? And nobody wants to be asked that. Now let me just mention briefly that girls were being raped in Evin prison as well. Still, people are not talking about it because it was done under Sharia law. Because a Sharia judge would come and say a few words, and then you were married off to the guard or to the interrogator, and he was allowed to do to you whatever he wanted. And it was legal. And it is still going on, and people don't talk about it because it's hard. And then if you say it, because it's so horrific, because it's so difficult to fit something like that in your head, that then people don't believe you. But I'm not the only one. There are many, many out there. And the issue is that it is still going on. One of the men who tortured me and then forced me to marry him, he had been a political prisoner during the time of the Shah in Evin prison, and he had been tortured for 3 years. They forced me to marry him. They forced me to convert to Islam. They changed my name. I lost my family. I lost my freedom. I lost everything. I lost who I was. How much more can you take away from a person and have them standing? I don't know. But there's one other thing I learned in Evin prison, in solitary confinement. I don't even know how many months I was in solitary. I lost count. But something I learned was that they can take all of that away from you, but there's one thing they cannot take away, and that is the answer that you give to a very important question. Tables turned for my torturer husband, and he picked up the length of cable and decided to protect his way of life. He actually believed in it. He was from the first generation of revolutionaries. He actually believed in something, and he thought it was the right thing to do. And I realized that if the tables turned for him, they are going to turn for me. And one day somebody put a length of cable in my hand and say, go for it. What is the answer I give to that question? My answer is no. That is revenge. That is not justice. Justice is time consuming. It needs lawyers and juries, and then 30 years later, you still don't have anything. That's justice. Revenge, quick, you can get it right now. But if I go for that solution, I would be feeding the violence that did this to me and to my generation. I will be feeding the monster of war and violence and torture that has been taking lives since the dawn of time. Violence feeds violence and makes it bigger. You cannot fix violence with violence. That's the basic rule. And because fear is such a strong emotion, we always forget that. So what is going on in Iran like now? Well, basically the same thing is going on in Iran right now. It's just become very systemized. You know, it's really established, and it has lost that belief part to it. So now the people who are in it, they are in it for power, and they're in it for money, really. That's what they are in it for. And as I said earlier, democracy is not an event, it's a process. The people of Iran have to find their own democracy. And I have a feeling that they're closer to it than any other country in the Middle East. I know some of our friends here said that the 2009 uprising in Iran, well, that was the beginning of what people call Arab Spring. I never liked that term from the very beginning, the Arab winter, or rather call it. I kind of disagree with that. I believe that the beginning of what is now called the Arab Spring was the 1979 revolution in Iran. In history, 30 years is nothing. This is what we are seeing in the Arab world is a continuation of that. Just put Hosni Mubarak and Shah next to each other, and you would be astounded at the similarities. Iran is 30 years ahead. We dug this really big hole and we fell into it 30 years ago. And we have been trying to dig our way out of it, but there are guns pointed to our heads. The people of Iran have been losing their children for the last 30 years, not to the nuclear program, come on. They have been losing their children to the terrible disregard for human rights in that country. This whole nuclear thing, to me, is a joke. How many people have actually died because of it? We don't even know. There are thousands of people who have died because of the terrible disregard for human rights in Iran for the last 30 years. That is the real monster. And the people of Iran need to deal with it. And Professor Jahanbegloo, he very beautifully said what needs to get done and what can Canada do and what the world can do. And of course, I'm not an academic. I'm just a writer. And I'm doing what I can do. I use art to communicate the experiences of myself and trying to communicate some of the experiences of my friends who were in Evin prison with the world through books, through theater, through films, through poetry, you name it. This is the way I fight this battle. And I think gradually, if we put all of our voices together, we are going to actually succeed. And Iran will again lead in the Middle East because it is 30 years old, because we already fell into the Islamist trap, and we have paid the price dearly for it. So I think we are the closest in the Middle East to anything that might resemble democracy. So again, back to the story of Hamid Qasemi Shal, I managed to get an appointment with the Minister of Consular Affairs, and I was actually supposed to rush to Ottawa tonight because the meeting was supposed to be tomorrow morning, but then Antonella, Hamid's wife, actually managed to get a meeting with Iranian chargé d'affaires who's going to be in Toronto tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. So Antonella, for the first time, is going to meet with an Iranian official to talk about her husband, just to say, can you please let my husband go and come home? He's a Canadian citizen. He hasn't done anything. So that is definitely a good thing. We have no idea what's going to happen during that meeting. Iranian officials are unpredictable, and he could just smile and nod, which is that's what they usually do, and then nothing will get done. But we are hoping. We are hoping nevertheless. And then the meeting with the consular affairs was postponed until April 4th, and we are hoping to go to Ottawa. But what I'm getting at about this story is that Hamid has been in prison for 4 years. And Antonella and I, for the last 2 years at least that I have been working with Antonella, we have been trying to meet with Mr. Harper and to ask him to write a letter. That's all. Don't attack Iran, please. Not asking for military action, a letter written to the Supreme Leader of Iran asking for Hamid's release. I know the Supreme Leader doesn't listen to anybody, but Hamid will hear about it. And he will know that the Prime Minister of Canada has stood up for him. And that could be the difference between life and death for a political prisoner in Iran. That is the difference that that letter is really going to make. So I'm asking Mr. Harper, please, go meet this minister, this consultant, this assistant, that aide, this, that. Like, honestly, it's been 4 years. Give us a break. Enough. So that is all that Antonella and I are asking right now from the Canadian government. Just write a letter and be a little bit vocal about this horrific situation that the world just has chosen not to notice. Why? Because Iran has oil? Because of I don't know why. If somebody could tell me why this is ongoing, why isn't Canada more outspoken about this situation? It's just mind-boggling to me. I'm sure many of you know about SS St. Louis, the ship that brought 900 Jews to the shores of Canada, and they were turned back. History has a habit of repeating itself. Please, let's stand up. Each one of us in this beautiful country of democracy has a voice. I love Canada because it gave my voice back to me. So please, let's join our voices. Saving one man is like saving the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marina, for your very personal and impassioned story. It must be very difficult to recount that story numerous times, but for the sake of humanity, you're doing it again, so we thank you for that. And just as an extra, Marina is an artist, and she has written a play that will be coming out, I believe, in April between the 10th and 20th here in Toronto. It's based on Prisoner of Tehran, so I encourage you also to have a look at that. Next, we have Raheel Raza. We have heard her on numerous television sets, heard her on our radio, and we've heard her speak at top universities, community groups, and institutions across the world, including parliaments and the United Nations. She's a Canadian award-winning writer, professional speaker, interfaith and intercultural diversity consultant, bridging the gap between East and West, and promoting cultural and religious diversity. In fact, she runs a forum for learning for youth to educate them about the dangers of radicalization and terrorism, and works alongside other groups to find solutions to these problems. As an indicator of her determination, Raheel had discovered from Canadian security experts that she was 6th most targeted activist in Canada, and her response was that she's working to become #1. She recently got back from talks in Geneva at the UNHCR, and today she'll be concentrating her talk on women's rights. Please welcome the author of Their Jihad, Not My Jihad, Raheel Raza.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you for those of you who have stayed on till now, and it allows me not to complain to the organizers for putting me last on the agenda, because, you know, like a good dessert, the best is always saved for last, right, Merle? I hope so. I'm a Pakistani by birth, Canadian by choice. Islam is my faith, and spirituality is the reason for my existence. Recently, some people have also termed me a Zionist agent. Please understand that I'm equally proud of all the above. My scripture, the Quran, tells me that humanity is but one community, and I abide by that. Let me add that to serve humanity in justice, I believe that I can't be a complete Muslim without also being partly Jewish and Christian. The title of my talk is inspired by a photography exhibition of 14 Middle Eastern women, which you see on the screen, taking place in Dubai as we speak. This particular photo is by Bushra al-Mutawakkil from Yemen and speaks sharply to the topic women on the verge, being pushed to become voiceless and invisible. It was Tawakkul Karman, Yemeni journalist, activist, and first Arab woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize last year, who said, and I quote, "My dear women, you have revolted from all over the countries of Yemen, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Syria in order to construct a dignified life and a better future. Therefore, there is no way that we should bend or go back." Heroic words in an ideal world. There is no doubt that the movers and shakers behind the so-called Arab Spring were sharp, courageous, talented, passionate, and inspirational women who thought that they would bring about change in the Middle East that would make their dreams come true, and that would give the next generation of women a better future. They aspired to bring about peaceful transition through collaboration between men and women, Muslims and non-Muslims, government and civilians. But as Tawakkul also points out, one of the necessities of partnership is for women to obtain their full rights. No dignity and no liberty for a nation which oppresses women and takes away their rights. The fact that the Arab Spring has fast turned into a dreadful winter for women is due to the underlying motives and designs of Islamism, carefully crafted and orchestrated by the Muslim Brotherhood as freedom. We already heard the other speakers mention the Al-Qaeda presence in the Middle East. So let's keep in mind that whenever there is a conflict or a vacuum in authority in the Muslim world, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafis, and Al-Qaeda are eagerly waiting in the wings to fill in that gap. And the main crux of their atrocities are on women and minorities. The tactics the Islamists use are ideas cloaked in religiosity, which is a very dangerous tactic because it's ideological warfare. I was at the United Nations Human Rights Commission last week, where I spoke, and I also heard testimony about women's rights being violated right across the spectrum in the Middle East. I was especially moved by a story of a young Syrian journalist who had been arrested, locked up, and tortured simply for reporting the news. During the revolutions and uprisings across the Middle East and North America, there have been numerous reports of violence targeting women committed by militia, soldiers, and police. Not surprising, I didn't hear any of this from the OIC, which is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and I actually criticized them in my talk for this, but let me share some of this information with you. In Syria, women have been abducted by pro-regime forces to spread fear within the population, and there are many reports of rape, arbitrary detentions, torture, forced disappearances, and summary executions. The situation has deteriorated to such an extent that the UN, of course, you know, has ordered a special commission of inquiry and continues to monitor the situation very, very closely. In Libya, rape was used as a weapon of war, and the stigmatization of the victims is such that they are condemned to silence. In Egypt, women participating in demonstrations have been sexually assaulted by so-called security forces, and several women were forced by the army to undergo virginity tests. Hana Edouard, who is the head of a charity called Al-Amal, which is hope in Arabic, said, and I quote, "Iraqi women suffer marginalization and all kinds of violence, including forced marriages, divorces, and harassment, as well as restrictions on their liberty, education, their choice of clothing, and their social life." Having spoken about people who want real change, when we speak about the Middle East, we sometimes tend to overlook the only real democracy in the region, which is Israel. I leave the issue about human rights, if not discussed already, to the Israelis themselves. What I can tell you, that as a Muslim woman traveling through Israel alone, not once, but consecutively for 3 years, I felt safer there than I would in my own land of birth. Sad, but true. So a panel on human rights wouldn't be complete without mention of my favorite champion of human rights, Saudi Arabia. I fast forward this section because human rights violations committed by that regime need an individual separate 2-day conference. In the words of Saudi journalist Dr. Khalid Al-Nawasser, who hesitantly writes in Arab News, I quote, "Saudi women urgently need equal rights," he says. "There are always men who want to control women's rights in the name of religion or otherwise." And I'd like to thank John Thompson for mentioning the threat of Salafism and exposing the challenges within countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. The UN Declaration of Elimination of Violence Against Women defines itself as any act of gender-based violence that results in psychological harm or suffering to women. Not being able to partake in the political, economic, and social decisions which will affect oneself and one's family is a form of violence. As such, the consequences of decisions made without the consultation of women can create psychological harm and suffering, and it's a violent act against women not to allow them to oppose or agree to the laws voted which directly concern them. In countries in transition, women are being marginalized and even excluded entirely from political bodies. In Egypt, there were no women in the 2 committees nominated to draft the new constitution. A new electoral law abolished measures guaranteeing women minimum representation in parliament, and women gained only 2% of seats in the recent elections. In Libya, the electoral law adopted by the country contains no quota for representation of women in elected bodies. In Morocco, a law adopted in October 2011 established a quota of only 15%, and there is only 1 woman minister in the 30-member cabinet compared to 7 in the previous government. In Tunisia, the 41-member government contains only 3 women, and in Saudi Arabia, wonderful, women just got the right to vote. But if they can't drive to the voting station, then the point is moot. So they play with our minds. For decades, Egyptian Muslim women have suffered because divorce was not an easy right for them, but they were working towards it. Recently, an independent MP has joined the heated debate over women's rights by suggesting a controversial draft law to limit the legal provisions for women to obtain divorce, suggesting the cancellation of khul, which is a woman's right to get a divorce in a court. Now, many of these women in the Middle East and North Africa were lobbying for nothing more than the right to have a say in the politics of their country, to be emotionally, economically, and intellectually liberated, and to participate in public life free from the fetters of oppression. Some of the issues faced by them aren't new. The UNDP has done extensive research into the status of Middle Eastern women, and the statistics showed that the level of education among Arab women is the lowest in the Muslim world. All this in a tradition where the Quran begins with the word iqra, read. And we believe that educating one woman is like educating an entire nation. So therefore, economic empowerment is an imperative for these women before change can take place. In the Arab world today, when a Muslim woman speaks out or is qualified to take a leadership role, she's called militant. I know that. I have been called that. If she speaks in ways expected of women, she's seen as an inadequate leader. If she speaks in ways expected of leaders, she's labeled as an inadequate woman. My friends, it's one thing to read about human rights atrocities in the news, but it's an entirely terrifying experience to hear it firsthand from the victims, as we've just heard from Marina. Mona Al-Tahawi is an Egyptian-American award-winning columnist and an international public speaker on Arab and Muslim issues based in New York. Mona reported extensively on the Egyptian uprising, urging women to speak out and stand up. In her passion, she also went to Tahrir Square last November, where she was sexually and physically assaulted. Last time I saw, her arm was still in a sling, but she was still fighting back. You may ask why there is so much resistance to women lobbying for their rights. And I'll tell you, because self-appointed caretakers of Muslim traditionalism feel threatened by the phenomena that a significant number of women are now seen in the public space, a space normally thought of as for men only. They see emancipated Muslim women as symbolization of westernization in a negative manner. In recent months, the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party has launched an attack on laws regulating personal status in Egypt. These laws have taken women back into the Dark Ages. One of the warning signs of fundamentalisms has been identified by the international organization Women Living Under Muslim Laws as anti-women policies. Whether it's attacks on freedom of movement, the rights to education and work under authoritarian and theocratic regimes, or imposition of unjust laws, all these are challenges for women to get equal status and justice. So the injection of feminist voices into any debate dealing with Islam and Muslims is a huge challenge. Distinctively misogynist Islamic fundamentalism has adversely affected women's political and social plight the world over. Essentially, there is a push in the Middle East to implement Islamic law, which, according to the political Islamist parties, means divine law, but is essentially man-made law with little or no regard for human rights and specifically for women's rights. To regard any person as property to be used and controlled is an insult to God, humanity, and this earth. Let me clarify that the entire discourse in the Quran on women is rights-based, but in the Sharia, thanks to male interpretations and concocted secondary literature, the entire discourse is duty-based for women and rights-based for men. Briefly, the word Sharia means personal, ethical, and moral guidance, and also reflects fluidity to be applicable to this day and age dealing with current issues. However, over time, Sharia was frozen with no movement, development, or reform, and therefore has started to stink, which is what happens when water is left stagnant. It has become totally man-made law, where women were not consulted in any of the lawmaking processes, thereby making Sharia very anti-women as we see it today. So how would these religious laws impact women if forced into place in the Middle East and North African region? And here I'm not even touching upon Pakistan and Iran, who we know are not the torchbearers of human rights, to say the least. Let me share some frightening statistics with you. UNIFEM estimates that more than 130 million girls and women alive today have undergone female genital mutilation, mainly in Africa and some Middle Eastern countries, and 2 million girls a year are at risk of mutilation. And if you think that this is happening somewhere far away, please think again. FGM is being practiced among immigrant communities in Europe, in Canada, and Australia. And many of our governments are turning a blind eye to this epidemic because they believe it's based in faith. and let me assure you with authority that it's not. Rape has become a weapon of war in many parts of the Arab world. While most of the Western world condemns rape and works to eradicate this trauma against women, there are those who make the sentencing of a perpetrator very hard, using loopholes in religious laws to punish only the women. In a study of honor killings in Egypt, 47% of the women were killed by a relative after the woman had been raped. In Jordan and Lebanon, 70 to 75% of the perpetrators of these so-called honor killings are the women's brothers. And here is the shocker. Part of Article 340 of the Jordan Penal Code states, and I quote, "He who discovers his wife or one of his female relatives committing adultery and kills, wounds, or injures one of them is exempted from any penalty." Not to leave you full of doom and gloom, there are always rays of light in the darkness. And I have great hope that the struggles of my sisters will bear fruit, since women themselves will bring about the change. And I call this the silent revolution. Many voices have been heard in the past year, including that of Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, who now heads UN Women. It's ironical, though, that the newly formed section of the United Nations, UN Women, has Pakistan on the executive board and Saudi Arabia as a contributing member. In Tunis, several thousand women demonstrated outside parliament to warn against any attempt by the new Islamist-dominated government to curtail their rights. Women in Morocco have brought about landmark changes to the divorce law and also succeeded in having polygamy banned. According to Saudi reports, women in Saudi Arabia are challenging the status quo, especially in regards to joining the Olympics. And Qatar is one example of how women bring about change. Thanks to Sheikh Hamoza, there are now more women in the Qatar education system than there are men. So we come to the question that all our speakers have spoken about, which is, what can Canada do? Canada is also on the executive for UN Women, and I look forward to more debates, discussions like this one, where we can find ways to support and empower the people who are aspiring for real change, not looking for ways to replace a dictator with a theocracy. As Mr. Gaynor said so eloquently, Canada's Muslim communities must stand up, speak out, and they must become an example to their fellow Muslims in the Middle East by shunning dogmatic practices and the rise of hate. If Canada is looking to do business in the Middle East or invite them here to do business, I suggest we first ask them to settle their human rights records regarding women especially. My personal thanks to this government in Canada, and I'm a proud Canadian when I say this, for taking a recent stand on unveiling for citizenship ceremonies and on honor killings. These are the steps that will lead to freedom, liberty, and equality, which are the values that I came to Canada for. And I hope that Canada will never compromise them for the sake of oil or energy. In ending, I'll ask your indulgence as I share with you my passion for this cause, not only because I'm Muslim, but because I'm a woman, and as Marina said, we must talk about these issues. These are a few lines from a longer piece that I wrote in my book, dedicated to all women, and the title of this is, "I Am a Woman, Celebrate Me." These are just 2 small verses. I am a mother from the Middle East, step by step trying to build bridges of peace, surrounded by bloody hell, where every shell has the name of an innocent bystander. I am Christian, Muslim, and Jew. I bleed the same as you. I am wife, sister, friend, and daughter. But our lives are devoid of any laughter. When our children leave home, we are uncertain if they will ever return. I am woman, validate me. Most of all, I am a woman like the rest of you, privileged for the chance to share in solidarity as I build the courage to stand up and speak out against atrocities heaped upon us, breaking the bonds of cultural and social fanaticism to forge a special bond with my sisters. In breaking the silence, I reach across the barriers of race and religion in the one cause that binds us together, Our feminine souls intertwined with the souls of others. They were women, therefore they died. We are women, hear our voices and support us. Thank you.
Thank you, Raheel. You put to rest the stereotype that Muslim women are meek or submissive, definitely. And you've been so courageous in this fight. As Dr. Gaynor had said, you have to be courageous. And you remind me of women in Iran who are very strong and who speak up, even despite the fact that they're constantly repressed. While the title of our talk is Canada's Human Rights Challenges in the Middle East, in the limited time that we have, I will be concentrating on my homeland country of Iran, and I'll be explaining how it's linked, how human rights is linked to the nuclear question. So to begin with, I'll just say a little bit about me so you understand where I'm coming from. I was born in Iran in 1979, and that was the start of the revolution that brought my country back into the Middle Ages, I often say. And my family was no exception to the human rights abuses that were happening at the beginning. My father, who's a non-political man, was the manager of the Sheraton Hotel at the time, and he was allowing, as he had always had, mingling between men and women, dancing, alcohol. But unbeknownst to him, these were forbidden under the new Islamic rules, so he was imprisoned, tortured, and almost executed. But through fate of luck, we managed to get him out while he had a quote-unquote temporary trial. Of course, he wasn't going to wait around for that, so he was on the first plane ride to Spain as soon as his wounds healed, and then our family joined him 2 months later, and then a year later immigrated to Canada, where I've made my life ever since. And I can honestly say that I've never taken my freedom and human rights for granted and opportunities. Most people, thankfully, are starting to learn more and more about Iran's human rights abuses and the condition there. But just as a brief summary, I'm going to go through some of the things that still affect the people in Iran. For one, freedom of expression has been curtailed with the imprisonment, torture, and sometimes even execution of those who say anything remotely anti-regime. So thereby they shut down newspapers, web blogs, news stations are forbidden that say anything remotely anti-regime. One example that was already mentioned, Hamid Qasemi Shal, he was imprisoned after he was visiting his ailing mother, spent 18 months in solitary confinement, and he faces execution. There's also another Iranian Canadian, Hossein Derakhshan, who is known as the the blog father of the Iranian blog stream. And a few years ago, he went back to Iran and initially got a death sentence, but it was reduced to 19.5 years imprisonment. There's also Saeed Malikpour, a Canadian resident who went back to Iran to visit, I think, his ailing father. And he is a software developer who developed a software to upload pictures, and that was later used to upload porn, and as a result, he was convicted of being at enmity against God or some god-awful sentence, and now he's facing imminent execution as well. So these are Canadians, there's our fellow Canadians that need our help and need us to keep up the pressure on our own government to help these individuals. Iran is now serious about cyber terrorism and has created a new Supreme Council of Cyberspace named Basir, with 120,000 cyber soldiers who are monitoring the internet sites, trying to pick up on things that dissidents are doing and blocking their websites and posting nonsense about them, just trumped up things, accusing them of all sorts of things, and hacking into computers, as they've done with my own website several times. Next, ethnic and religious minorities are heavily persecuted, including Kurds, Turks, Jews, Christians. There's a a Christian pastor, Yusuf Nadarkhani, who also faces execution. He is a pastor and will not recant his faith, so he faces the crime of apostasy. And Baha'is, that was just mentioned. In fact, Baha'is are among the worst persecuted. They are denied access to higher education. They're denied certain job postings. And 7 of their top leaders are currently in prison, and we do not know what their fate's going to be. As we've mentioned, women are heavily discriminated against, and literally under the law, the life of a woman is valued at being half of a man. So, for example, if you get into a car accident and you kill a man, you would have to pay twice as much than if you killed a woman. Same goes for testimonials in trials. The testimony of a woman is worth only half of a man's. And Marina already mentioned some of the other discriminatory laws which involve custody and divorce are discriminatory. And in order to travel, you need permission from your husband or father in order to travel if you're a woman. Children's rights are disregarded. Despite the fact that Iran has signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Charter of the Rights of the Child, they continue to execute those under the age of 18. This is in direct violation. And there's currently 160 children on death row in Iran for crimes such as homosexuality, sex outside of marriage, drug trafficking, apostasy, as I said, and of course, murder. I'll never forget the case of this one boy, Makvan Muludzadeh, who was engaged in homosexual activity when he was 13 years old, and when he turned 18, they carried out his execution. In fact, Iran has the highest number of executions in the world per capita, coming second in terms of numbers only after China. And just last year alone, there was 676 executions in Iran. And not to mention the thousands of political prisoners that are currently in Iran languishing in the prisons. And we must not forget the overall socioeconomic situation in Iran. It's terrible. First of all, as Rami Jahanbegloo already mentioned, 70% of the population is below the age of 30. So they're a young, thriving community of youth who want the same freedoms that we have here in Canada. They want to be able to hold their boyfriend's hands on the streets or be able to listen to music without fearing repercussions. And despite Iran potentially being one of the richest countries on the planet, given that it has a massive oil reserve, there is high rates of poverty, high unemployment. Since the sanctions, even more inflation, higher unemployment. HIV/AIDS is a grave problem. Prostitution has gone up. Traffic accidents is a problem. Pollution has become a grave problem. And this is perpetuated with the mismanagement of funds and corruption at the governing levels. So with the combination of this socioeconomic malaise with the fear of repression, with these human rights abuses, it equals massive discontent. Iranians are not happy with the current regime. They don't want a theocracy whereby their elected leaders are vetted in advance by a council of guardians who pre-vets those who are about to run to make sure that they're Islamic or not, or adhere to the original tenets of the Islamic Revolution. More than anyone on this planet, more than the Canadians in this room, more than Israelis who may be fearing for their existential threat, more than Saudis who may be fearing the expanse of Shia Islam, it is the Iranian people themselves that want change, that want fundamental change. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Iranians want a constitution based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They want democracy, they want freedom, they want the rule of law, they want the basic opportunities that we enjoy here in Canada. And what I want to really stress here is that human rights is not some lofty, abstract idea that Iranians are looking towards or that people aspire to. It's a serious matter that we often forget. And what I want to stress is that this subject needs to be seriously looked at because it's inextricably linked with the nuclear question. The million-dollar question on everyone's mind is whether Iran will develop nuclear capabilities to the point where they'll have a nuclear warhead, and whether the Israelis will intervene militarily. I believe that in order to solve a problem, we need to be asking the right questions, and I don't think that we are asking the right questions. We are focusing on the problem being a quote-unquote nuclear Iran, but the problem is not a nuclear Iran per se. What the problem is the nature of this regime. If Iran was a democratic, transparent country, then we wouldn't be, this wouldn't be posing a problem to Iranians themselves, Israelis, or the world entire. It would be no different than France or the United States or Great Britain having nuclear capabilities, because it would be at the hands of stable representatives answerable to the people and answerable to the international community, and not some preordained supreme leader. What makes this situation dangerous is that nuclear capabilities are at the hands of fanatical leaders that brutally repress their own citizens and the rights of their own people. Extremist Shia leaders that believe, if not welcome, the coming of the 12th Imam, the hidden Mahdis that's supposed to come out of hiding to bring salvation to the people at a time of great destruction. Whether or not Ahmadinejad or the supreme leader actually believe this or use this as a tool to garner the support of the few fanatical groups in Iran, I'm not sure. I don't think this is a suicidal regime. In fact, I think they're actually quite rational actors in Iran. Rational in the sense that they want to cling to power above anything and will do anything in their power to maintain it. And that's why they're so eager to have nuclear capabilities in order to legitimize their position and keep secure in this so-called untouchable category. One thing I do worry about, though, is that they can justify their actions and lies by using the concepts like taqiyya, which basically is a term which sanctions lying if it's for the expanse of Islam or to solidify Islam. So the question is, how do we remove this regime to contain not only the nuclear issue, but to help protect lives of Iranians themselves, prevent terrorism by proxy groups, as we've seen Iran channel large amounts of money to Hamas and Hezbollah, and start to build peaceful relations in the region, thereby preventing an arms race from ensuing with surrounding Arab nations, preventing the military equipping of Assad's regime in Syria, allowing freedom-loving Iranians to regain their country, to get the country back into their own control in their own hands, and stopping this chaos. The second question is this possible? I say yes, it is possible, because we've seen it before. We saw it after the fraudulent June 2009 presidential elections, which brought Ahmadinejad back to power, where millions of people came out on the streets to protest. They weren't protesting because they love Karoubi or Mousavi and they want those individuals in power. This was something bigger. They were enraged that within the limited parameters of having these few select leaders to choose from, that even that right was disrespected. And so for months on end, you could hear people shouting on the streets, death to Ahmadinejad, down with the regime, death to Khamenei, where is my vote, Allahu Akbar. While those millions of people were silenced at that particular time, they still are continuing with their protests underground. The world at that time finally got a glimpse that there is a clear division between the regime officials that are in power and the vast majority of freedom-loving Iranians. What was disheartening, though, at the time was that their cries fell on deaf ears, and it seemed like the sacrifices they made in their, giving up their lives was in vain when they saw world leaders stay silent, or leaders like Obama extending an olive branch and willing to negotiate with these regime monsters. I call them monsters because these regime officials were the ones that were out onto the streets shooting innocent people like Neda Agha Sultan, or torturing people in prison, pulling their nails out, raping them in these cells, and throwing them at the side of the road. Ramin Jahan Begludov said it best a few months ago at the Halifax International Security Forum when he said, negotiating with this regime is like playing chess with a monkey. Basically, you make one move with the chess piece and the monkey just eats the pieces off the table. And that's exactly right. Let me assure you that there is a middle ground. We mustn't extend an olive branch to these tyrants. And yet, on the other side, we should not consider intervening militarily either. War is just too costly all round in blood and treasure for all parties involved. I don't want anybody here to underestimate the pride that Iranians have for their country. And it would be an unfortunate event if there was military intervention. The Iranian people, even though they wouldn't want to do this, they would side with the regime in order to protect their sovereignty and rally around the flag. And any advancement that human rights defenders or peace activists or democracy activists have made thus far in Iran would all be wiped away. So how do we do it? How can we stop the ticking time bomb? First of all, we must take advantage of the current vulnerabilities that we see in Iran to play in our favor. For example, there's rifts at the clerical level, fissures in parliament, and there's a power struggle between Ahmadinejad right now and the supreme leader Ali Khamenei. So we must continue with heavy, targeted sanctions that cripple the IRGC, that rules this country, because as Ramin Jahan Begludov already said, Iran is moving from a theocracy into more of a military dictatorship. We must continue with strict and more comprehensive travel bans and asset freezes, not only on regime officials, but their families, because they're using them as sort of as mules to bring in their funds to countries like Canada. Engage in symbolic acts to support the freedom-loving Iranians. We have to show that we're on their side and that we are isolating these regime officials that do not represent the voices of the people. And then we can do this by, as we already have, by walking out during international conferences like at the UN or other symbolic acts. We must force the right for the Human Rights Special Rapporteur, Dr. Ahmad Shahid, to carry out an independent investigation in the country. The previous one, Philip Alston, was not allowed, and they're not allowing him. I know the UN is limited in what it can do, but we have to start somewhere, and UN member states have to be more aggressive when member states do not comply with the demands set forth. On the whole, what we're trying to do is empower the civil society in Iran. This includes women, youth, union leaders, etc. One way to do this is by supporting media, satellite channels, providing them new tools, technology that's safe for the dissemination of their communication on the outside of the country and receiving it, because they're always being monitored. So we need to provide them with these kinds of tools. There needs to be a multilateral plan among the community of nations to organize. An Iranian-American strategist named Karim Sajjadpour from the Carnegie Foundation suggested, besides covert operations, in a less lethal option, is to create defense-related research facilities in Iran, disrupting them, and financial and other commercial records could be scrambled. These were just some of his examples. One of the key things that the Iranian dissident community severely lacks is unity and funds. And this is where we can come in, and countries like Canada and European countries. I believe if we have the funds in place from private institutions or these countries, as I said, we could develop a think tank or democracy center of sorts in order to hear the clear, united message of Iranians. One thing I noticed when I travel to different countries is that the members of parliament say, we're confused, there's so many dissenting views, we want to hear one voice. We don't have this capacity. So we could even host it here in Toronto, and Ramin Jahanbegloo could be the chair. I've already spoken to him about this idea, and he's very willing. So we could gather experts from around the world to form a plan for a transitional government. And secondly, what we don't talk about enough is a transition of transitional justice. Because we've talked a lot about, how do we bring down this regime, how do we do this and that, but we don't speak enough about what happens the day after. We don't want chaos. We don't want another Iraq or even another Afghanistan. We want to know what happens, and we want to know, what do we do with people like Saeed Mortazavi, who was the chief prosecutor of Iran, who was implicated in the murder and rape of Canadian photojournalist Zahra Kazemi? Do we try them in international tribunal? Do we set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission at some point? Do we provide a deadline to the members of the IRGC and say, if you come forward before a certain amount of time, like a deadline, then you will be exempt from further persecution? What prosecution? We have to be asking these questions, and we need a sort of center to be able to work on these issues. So just in conclusion, I'd just like to say that whatever we do, we need to act fast. We have a little bit longer than we thought. Well, according to a recent Reuters article entitled, "Intel Shows Iran Nuclear Threat Not Imminent," it assesses that it will take about a year to produce a bomb and then another 1 or 2 years to put it into a missile. So we don't have very much time. We need a multi-pronged approach to deal with Iran's human rights, democracy, and nuclear issues. If we give the capabilities to the people of Iran, inside Iran, they will be able to do this on their own with better results than anything we can do on the outside. It always has to come from the ground up. We must keep up the pressure from here, or else we may see the paws of the regime crawl into our own spaces here in Canada. As I said, we've already seen this with funds coming in from Iran, from regime officials to Toronto. What also bothered me was a couple weeks ago, I learned that there's some First Nations chiefs here in Canada that went to the Iranian embassy in Ottawa, and we're wanting to speak to Iranian officials, and the Iranian government has extended an invitation to these chiefs, and they're seriously consider going to Parliament to speak on their human rights abuses and to negotiate on other terms. Now, I don't know what kind of negotiations they're going to have, but it's truly offensive as an Iranian Canadian to know that the First Nation, these certain First Nations individuals who know better than anyone about human rights abuses would be neglecting the fact that Iranians have been suffering so gravely under this current regime. So we just have to keep our eyes open. We have to continue to spread the message and keep up the pressure. So thank you so much for your time to listen. I can't understand some of this writing. Okay. Oh my goodness. When CSIS and the RCMP government officials seek to consult with the Muslim community leaders, are they being sufficiently discerning in distinguishing between one organization and another? Perhaps, Raheel, you can answer this question.
Thank you for that question. That actually was a question that I wrote and sent to the two speakers from CSIS and the RCMP when they spoke about community outreach. I wanted to ask them when their community outreach would reach me. I've been here 23 years and I'm still waiting for that community outreach, and certainly some of the community leaders that they engage, I believe, are part of the problem. And these are people who very cleverly cloak themselves as community leaders, and calling themselves community leaders certainly doesn't remove any of the suspicions of the activities they're involved in. So I would suggest that these two organizations, who are well known for the research work that they can do, look very carefully into the backgrounds and fundings of these so-called communities, community organizations, before they engage in dialogue with them, and also knock on some doors of really progressive, liberal, moderate Muslims. Thank you.
Someone was asking the spelling of Hamid Qasemi Shal's name. Hamid is spelled H-A-M-I-D, Qasemi G-H-A-S-S-E-M-I-S-H-A-L-L. And if you didn't catch that, you can come up to me or Marina afterwards. There's a question. What is the breakdown of the Iranian population percentage-wise in terms of Zoroastrians, Muslims, Christians, etc.? Do you know that?
Yeah, I do. Well, of course, these numbers are not exact, because I don't know how much you can trust the Iranian officials under the numbers that they release. But the last numbers that I saw, there are about 50,000 Zoroastrians left in Iran. But of course, I have also heard that a lot of young Iranians are secretly converting to Zoroastrianism. So of course, the government is not going to announce that. And the number of Christians is at around 300,000 or so, probably a little less. And the majority of them are Assyrian and Armenian. And then the number of the Jewish population, I'm not quite sure, but it must be at around 7,000 or 8,000. This is the last thing I heard when I was in Jerusalem when I was speaking to the Iranian community there. And the number of Baha'i, again, is difficult to say because some people are also converting to Baha'ism without actually announcing it. So the number of that is also around 300,000, probably even more than that. And that is out of a 73 million or so population.
This is for Marina Nemat and Raza Raheel. What do you think of the opinion of some that the proven lies with the Ayatollahs, not Ahmadinejad? Do you think the Ayatollahs may get rid of him if he becomes too power hungry?
Well, I think they are already getting rid of Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad's days are numbered. The rift between Ahmadinejad and Khomeini has just become bigger and bigger by the day, and the reign is going to end. And actually what I have heard that I think is really, really probable is that Ayatollah Khomeini might try to actually take out the position of the president. So basically it's a charade anyhow, so why continue it? So, they are electing the people who are allowed to run for presidency in Iran. So basically it's a game, and all Iranians are aware that it is a game. So why even keep it up? It's not even worth it anymore. So, you know what, I just recommend we all forget about Ahmadinejad. It's the end of him. And the person we really have to be concerned with is Khamenei, and we really have to be concerned with the Revolutionary Guard. Those are the people that we have to be concerned with.
Okay, I'm not sure if I quite understand this question, but perhaps you'll decipher what it says, Raheel. It says, Mrs. Raheel, thank you for the hats or something, but on Israel democracy, how do you define half of Israel's population, Arab, Israelis, and something class citizens? What about segregated but forced by fundamentalist Jewish against women? Did you understand?
No.
Okay, neither did I. Okay, to all the panelists, we understand that the so-called Arab Spring is due in no small part to a large democratic shift, the coming of age of the youth cohort now constituting the majority of the population in much of the Middle East. In the power vacuum that will ensue in the aftermath of recent events, what percentage of these young people will support a new enlightenment, an open westernized society, and how many will prefer further Islamization and theocratic regimes? Which countries are likely to fall, which way of their own accord, in terms of popular support? Wow.
I don't know, do we look like we have a crystal ball? Honestly, I don't have God's phone number. I wish I did, or email address for that matter. Yeah, I would have a lot of questions to ask. But honestly, I don't think anybody knows. You know, all I can tell you on this, you know, again, I'm not an academic or a politician, I'm just a writer. But all I can tell you is that there has never been a revolution in the history of mankind, and I don't use the word never often, but there has never been one where people get on the streets and they yell, we want a horrible dictatorship. No, it doesn't happen. They want freedom and democracy. But again, there's a lot of chaos. You know, these youth that you see on the streets, they're on Facebook and Twitter, yes, they create the revolution, but they are disorganized and they have no idea where they really want to go. And then you get organizations like a Muslim Brotherhood that they're beginning to look more like charitable organization where they give charity and bread and food to people, that they attract these young people to them with beautiful words and empty promises and that sort of thing that actually look really beautiful to these young people. So they get fooled into following these organizations, and by the time they find out what a terrible mistake they have made, it is now too late, and 3/4 of them are already in prison, being tortured and executed and that sort of thing. This is exactly what happened in Iran, and this is why I said that it is important to think of Iran and what happened there actually as the beginning of what we are now calling the Arab Spring. I have no idea where this is going to go. We can just hope that you know, it will end up better than it ended up in Iran. But again, there's no guarantee. And you know, there was also this talk about Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that. And let's not forget that information doesn't necessarily translate into wisdom. Information and wisdom are two very different concepts. People are people. Whether you have Facebook or you don't have Facebook, we still feel the same kind of emotions. And when there is an organization like, let's say, Muslim Brotherhood, that is telling the people, the young people, that there's a boogeyman out there called America or Israel or whatever, and that's, you know, so there is the power of fear that plays into this equation, and we have to keep that into account. So again, exactly where does it go? I have no idea, but of course we can help it. And how we can help it is by trying to share the wisdom that we have actually gained in our lifetime with our youth, with young people. I speak at a lot of high schools. And actually, I find that speaking to teenagers and trying to explain to them what's going on in the world is one of my favorite activities. And it's amazing how smart they are and how well they listen.
Wise last words from Marina Nemat and Raheel, Raza. This comes to an end, a conclusion of our wonderful conference put on by Advocates for Civil Liberties and the Atlantic Council of Canada. Thank you.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lawrence Saltman. I'm the president of the Advocates for Civil Liberties. It's my pleasure to say thank you to all of you, and those of you who stayed this very long afternoon and evening in particular, thank you. To our speakers, thank you. It's been quite a journey, I think. We've had panels that have, on the one hand, predicted that the Arab Spring is going to produce the possibility of hope and freedom, and others who say it's an Arab winter, and that the likelihood is chaos, not improvement. We've had the other panels explain how Canada can form better business relations with certain countries in the Middle East. Turkey, for example, presents wonderful opportunities for us. Israel, with its discovery of gas, Canada can form relations, better relations with Israel, but then we have to be very wary. We've heard about how through intelligence services, espionage is increasing. There are threats in cyberspace for Canadians, not only who are in the Middle East, but right here in Canada. It's been a very wide diplomatic, economic, political discussion, but we've also had very personal stories about what's happened to individuals who have gone through the terrible oppression of regimes like Iran that touch our hearts. Our two organizations, the Atlantic Council for Canada, with its promotion of the so-called Atlantic values, democracy, Western culture, freedom, and our organization, Advocates for Civil Liberties, whose mission is to bring civil discourse to the discussion in the Middle East about Israel and to combat anti-Semitism. We have tried to put on a conference today that has been able to span the spectrum, that has presented these sometimes differing views, but different perspectives, to educate, to communicate, to bring together many people from diverse communities to hear these stories, to understand what's happening in the world. And I think we've succeeded, and I thank you all for attending, and I hope we'll be able to put on another conference for you next year. Now, thank you. There is a post-closing reception for those who have registered as VIPs and for the speakers in King Room 1, just outside of the hall. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.